What's up guys, I'm Chirag and welcome to part 8 of tutorial series on deploying Flask application on the EC2 instance with Docker. In the previous tutorial we had deployed a Flask application on the EC2 instance with Docker, and probably in this tutorial I will take you through on how we can use bridge network driver and communicate among containers and the host network, right? So let's get started. So I have already logged in into the EC2 instance, right? So let me clear my screen. So the very first thing we will do is that we will list out the running containers. So what I will do is sudo docker ps. So we have this container running. So let me kill this one. And now there is no container up and running, right? Okay, so as the next step, we are going to list the network that we have. So it's going to be sudo. So when I say network, it's Docker network, right? So sudo docker network ls. So we have these drivers, right? So one is bridge, host, and none, right? So probably we can define custom network, but let's start with the default network, right? So default bridge network. So the very first thing that we have to do is edit the docker compose file. So cd flask docker vim docker compose.yml, right? So here, as you can see, we have network underscore mode as host, right? So what we are going to do is I'm going to comment this ports, because we are not going to access the application on port 8000. Instead we are going to access this application on port 80 via Nginx web server, right? So we will not require port 8000 to be exposed, right? Also I will comment network underscore mode, right? Because by default it consider network mode as bridge network driver, right? Until and unless we explicitly define network underscore mode as host, right? So here also I will comment this. And one more thing we have to edit is the environment variable, that is server underscore name. So I have a new public IP address over here. So I'm going to replace this server underscore name with the current public IP of the EC2 instance, right? Now once we have comment network underscore mode and ports, right, what we have to do is we have to expose port 80 over here within Nginx, right? Because from one of the previous tutorial, if you remember, then I had explained that while we use network mode as bridge, we have to explicitly expose the port to the host or the system network, right? Without that we will not be able to access the port or the application, right? So here it's going to be ports 8080, right? And here apart from this we are going to add one more directive, that is networks directive over here, right? So it's going to be networks. Now here we want to use default bridge network, right? So it's going to be default colon, which will be followed by the driver. So it's going to be driver colon, it's bridge, right, in our case. And we are done. So when we define default network, it will be applicable to all the services, all the containers that is mentioned under services, right? So let's save this. and let's try to run the containers. So it's going to be sudo docker compose up hyphen build, right? Enter. So it's running and it's up. Let's try to access the application. Oh, it says bad gateway. And why is that? Yeah, so one more change we have to make is we have to edit or update the Flask app configuration or the Nginx configuration file, right? Because if we are using bridge network, we will not be able to access the application at o.o.o.o. So let's have a look. So vim flask app dot configuration. So here within proxy pass, instead of o.o.o, we have to give reference to the container name. We have to refer to the Flask app application container basically. So it's going to be Flask app, right? So that's what we had defined in the container name, and it's on port 8000, right? So escape colon, save this file. Now let's try to rerun the docker compose. So it's running and I think it should work now. So as you can see, we have the Flask application up and running, right? Now as a next step, what I will show you is, let's try to comment ports, right? Just to give you an example. So vim docker compose .yaml. So let's comment this out. Right, save this file, clear. Let's run this again and let's try to access the application. So as you can see, now we are not able to access the application, right? Because when we use bridge network, then we have to explicitly expose the port to the system network, right? So that's the reason it's not working. So we have to uncomment the ports, right? Let's save this and now it should work. Let's reload and yes, it's working, right? Now let's run with -d parameter. Let's detach it so we can perform or execute another commands, right? And now it's running in background. So let's reload once again and it's working, right? So if you remember, then we had did sudo docker network ls. At that point of time, we had only 3 drivers, that is bridge, host and none, right? So now let's try to execute that command again, sudo docker network ls. So now as you can see, it has created another driver, that is flask docker underscore default, right? Now what if I go ahead and delete this driver? So let's have a look. So the very first thing we have to do is we have to stop the running container. So sudo docker ps sudo docker kill. So before deleting the container, let's try to inspect this network driver. So let's see whether the running Flask application or the Nginx server is using this network or not, right? So it's going to be sudo docker network inspect flask docker underscore default, right? So now if we look here, as you can see, there are two containers that is using this network driver. If we look at the configuration, so it says scope local, driver as bridge, right? And the name is Flask docker underscore default. So what's the type of this network? You can see the labels over here. So it says default, right? Default network for bridge. And within containers, as you can see, we have Flask app and Nginx container using this network, right? So that's it. Now let's go ahead and try to delete this network, or maybe first let's kill the container. So sudo docker ps sudo docker kill. We will kill both the containers. Right, and again we will do sudo docker network ls, and we will delete this network. So it's going to be sudo docker network rm, that is remove, and the driver name, and the network name, and it's deleted, right? Now if I try to run the docker compose again, let's see what happens. So sudo docker compose up -- build. So it's running and it threw an error saying error for Flask app cannot start service, Flask app network not found, right? So ideally it should create or auto create the network, right? But it threw an error. So why did it throw an error? So let's try to list the network again. So we had deleted the default network, right? So sudo docker network ls. So as you can see, the Flask docker underscore default is being recreated, but we are unable to run the docker compose, or we are unable to run the containers, right? So to deal with that error, so you have to look for the exited containers and you have to remove them, right? So it's going to be sudo docker container ls -a. So this will list the stopped container. So due to these exited containers, we are unable to run the docker compose, right, and build the new containers. So what you can do is you can do sudo docker compose down. So as you can see, it says removing Nginx, removing Flask app, and removing network Flask docker underscore default. And now if you do sudo docker container ls -a, then there will be no exited containers, right? So basically you have to remove those containers, right? And you have to rerun docker compose again. So sudo docker compose up -build, and now it will not throw an error. So as you can see, it's up and running and we will be able to access the application, right? So this is for the default network. Now what if you want to create the custom network, right? So let's have a look how we can do that, or how we can achieve that. So let me stop this again. And the default network is auto created, and instead if you are opting out for creating the custom network and it's not pre-created, then it will create on the fly, right? So again we are going to edit the docker compose file. So it's going to be vim docker compose.yml, right? So to define a custom network, we have to use networks parameter under individual service, right? So enter, it's going to be networks colon and the custom network name that you want to use, right? So I will simply define backend maybe, or you can give any other name you want, right? So I want to use backend network for my both the containers, that is Flask app and Nginx. So it's not necessary that you have to use the same network. It depends on what use case or under which scenario, right? So I also want to run Nginx on backend, so I have to explicitly define that. So networks colon backend, right? And now here I have to add the same, so that is going to be the backend network colon, and I have to define the network driver type, right? So it's going to be same as driver colon bridge, right? So let me comment this out, the default one, so that no confusion occurs, right? So what we did, we just defined the networks parameter within individual container or individual service, and now it will create the backend as a network, as it has created Flask app underscore default network for us, right? And same goes for Nginx. We add networks parameter and the network name that we want to use, and we had updated the networks directive, that is the network name, that is backend, and we want to use driver as bridge, or the network driver as bridge, right? So let's go ahead and save this file. Now let's try to run Docker compose, and I think it should work. Let's try to load the application, and it's working fine, right? Now let's run this in the background. So we will use -d detached parameter, so that I can show you the networks clear. So sudo docker network ls, right? So now as you can see, the backend driver has been created, right? And if we go ahead and inspect that driver, so sudo docker network inspect flask docker underscore backend, enter. So now as you can see, the driver is bridge. So this is the isolated network from the system or the host network, right? And we have two containers running, that is Nginx and Flask app, right? So this is how you can also create the custom network. So let's clear this out, and it's working fine, right? So let's try one more thing. Let's again update the docker compose file. Now for example, you have a database, right? So apart from Flask app and Nginx, you have one more thing, and you want to run that DB on another network, and you want to keep it isolated, right? So what you can do is you can achieve that by using networks, and you can define, for example, db underscore network. So let's try to have a look at such scenario. So I'm not going to define database over here, but I will simply show you. So if I say, instead of backend, if I say front end, so what will happen is Flask app or the Flask application will run on this network, or it will use this front end network, and Nginx will use backend network, right? And as a result, both the containers will not be able to communicate among itself, right? So let's have a look how it goes. So Flask app is on front end, Nginx is on back end, right? So here we have to define front end within networks directive. So copy, front end, right? And let's save this. Now if I try to run docker compose, not with a -d, because this time it's going to throw an error, So I want to show you that. So it's running, right? So if I try to load the application, then it's not going to work, right? So it says file not tube. So now as you can see, the Nginx server is being exited with code 1, right? So the reason is it's not unable to access the Flask app container or the local host on which our Flask application is running, right? Because both the things are running on different drivers or different network drivers, right? So that's the reason both are isolated and not able to communicate, and it keeps throwing error, right? So that's how you can define multiple networks and run individual containers on different networks, right? So let me try to cover one more thing. So I will say vim docker compose.yaml, right? So now as you can see, this front end is not able to communicate to backend and vice versa, right? So now if you want a container which can access both the networks or both the containers, right? So what you can do is you can define one more thing saying, so we are not going to run this. I am just trying to give you an example. So let's say application, and let me copy this, and you have this build somewhere, and then what you can do is under networks you can say front end as well as backend, right? So what will happen is Flask app and Nginx will not be able to communicate with each other, app but this app will have access to both the containers or both the network, right? So it will be able to access the Flask application as well as the Nginx server, right? So this is how you can implement in terms of database, right? Because ideally we don't expose DB to public, right? So what we can do is we can keep that database in the isolated network. Basically by default, Compose sets up a single network for your application, as we had seen earlier, right? While we were configuring default network, right? But each container for a service joins the default network and is both reachable by other containers on that network and probably discoverable by them at the host name identical to container name, right? So that's all I wanted to cover in this tutorial, right? I know it's quite overwhelming, or it's kind of lengthy, it's complex, but I tried my best to take you through the bridge network driver and the network isolation, along with creation of custom network and using default network with bridge network driver, right? So well, that's it for now. Until that time, if you want me to do tutorial on any use case or service, then please leave them below and I will try my best to come up with a tutorial as soon as possible. And if you have any queries or comments, then again please leave them below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and see you next time.